17-year-old Zoe Chan stepped off the school bus in full military fatigues, her combat boots echoing off the concrete as whispers erupted around her like wildfire. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Lincoln High parking lot, but nothing could hide the stares that followed her every step. Was she seriously going to homecoming week like this? Madison Torres, the student body president with her perfectly straightened blonde hair and designer everything, laughed loudly enough for half the parking lot to hear. Her voice carried that special tone of distrust mixed with superiority that only comes naturally to those who have never questioned their place in the social hierarchy. Within minutes, phones were out, and Zoe's photos were being shared across social media. The captions came thick and fast. GI girl impersonator, not changing until Friday, and someone's having an identity crisis. Zoe could almost feel the notifications ringing across the school's invisible network as her image spread from phone to phone. Each repost added another layer to her humiliation. She clenched her jaw as she passed a group of American football players gathered around their raised pickup trucks, their leather jackets glinting in the morning light. Jake Morrison, a quarterback whose ego was somehow larger than his already imposing frame, nudged his teammates and began marching in an exaggerated formation behind her. 1-2, 1-2, he commanded in the mocking voice of a drill sergeant, while his friends saluted with theatrical precision. 10-4, we got a real trooper here, boys. The laughter that followed felt like needles on Zoe's skin, but she kept walking, keeping her back straight and her eyes forward. She had long ago learned that showing weakness only made things worse. Her oversized camouflage jacket hung loosely on her slight frame. The sleeves were rolled up, revealing arms that shook slightly despite her calm exterior. The fabric still held the faintest scent of her father's cologne, a detail that both comforted and broke her heart every time she wore it. She'd transferred to Lincoln High just 2 months ago, when her mother married a kind but quiet man named Robert, who worked for an insurance company. The move was necessary. Her mother couldn't stay in their old town where every street corner held memories of David Chun. But starting over at a new school her senior year was like trying to join a movie halfway through. Everyone already knew their roles, their groups, their place in a carefully constructed social ecosystem. It was exactly the kind of attention Zoe had hoped to avoid. She'd planned to fly under the radar, to quietly graduate and go to college where she could start over again. But today wasn't about fitting in, or making friends, or navigating the treacherous waters of school politics. Today marked 3 years since the worst day of her life, and wearing her father's uniform was the only way she could feel close to him, the only ritual that made the unbearable weight of his absence bearable. Period. As she approached the main building, more students began to notice her unusual attire. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, heads turned to follow her movement. Some pointed openly, others whispered behind covered hands. A group of theater-goers outside the drama department began an impromptu performance, pretending to dive for cover and shouting, "Coming!" with dramatic flourish. Even the usually apathetic seniors, who usually didn't care about the younger students, pulled out their phones to record what they clearly considered a morning of entertainment. Zoe's locker was located in the busiest hallway in the school, a cruel twist of fate that meant her daily routine involved enduring the ordeal of judgment. When she reached the familiar blue metal door, her heart sank. Someone had been there before her. Taped to her locker was a handwritten note. The words, "G.I. Jane seeks attention," were written in thick black marker on a pad of legal paper. The handwriting was deliberately sloppy, meant to hide the writer's identity, but the cruelty was crystal clear. She ripped the note off with unnecessary force, crumpling it in her fist as students continued to file past, many slowing to get a better look at the girl in camo, who had somehow become the highlight of the morning. The combination lock felt slippery under her sweaty fingers as she tried to open it, the numbers blurring slightly as tears threatened to prick her eyes. "Nice suit," a voice said behind her. Zoe turned to see Ashley Kim, a girl from her gym history class who had always seemed relatively normal compared to the social media-obsessed masses. But even Ashley's tone held a note of bewildered amusement, as if Zoe were a mystery she couldn't solve. "Is this for a project or something?" Zoe finally opened her locker and began pulling out her books for first period, her movements mechanical and precise. Something like that, she said quietly, not trusting herself to say more lest her voice crack. The truth was too complicated, too painful, and too personal to share with someone who was, essentially, a stranger. Period. As the first bell rang and the students began their reluctant march toward their classrooms, Zoe caught her reflection in the small mirror she'd hung inside her locker door. Around her neck, under the collar of her old school shirt, hung her father's dog tags. In the reflection, she could almost see him standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his voice telling her to stand tall and proud. But when she blinked, there was only the bustling hallway and the weight of 100 curious eyes. By third period, the bullying had evolved from casual taunts to something more deliberate and cold. Zoe's chemistry class was her usual refuge, a place where equations and formulas provided clear, logical answers in a world that often made no sense. But today, even the sanctuary of science couldn't protect her from the growing storm of attention her uniform was causing. She took her usual seat at the back of the room, hoping to blend into the background. But Tyler Brooks had other plans. Tyler was the type of student who thrived on chaos, the class clown whose humor often crossed the line into cruelty. He'd been watching Zoe all morning, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce, and chemistry provided the perfect stage for his introduction when Mrs. Patterson began explaining molecular structures on the board. Tyler made his move. He stood up abruptly, declaring that he needed to sharpen his pencil, but instead took a deliberately meandering route that led him straight to Zoe's desk. With theatrical precision, he accidentally knocked her textbook, notebook, and pencil case to the floor with a sweep of his arm. "Ouch," he said loudly, his voice dripping with false innocence. "Sorry about that explosion." He made exaggerated sound effects. Wham! Boom! Gesturing wildly with his arms, mimicking the chaos of a battlefield. The timing was perfect. Mrs. Patterson had her back to him, writing formulas on the board, completely unaware of the drama unfolding behind her. The class erupted in barely suppressed laughter. Students covered their mouths, their shoulders shaking with suppressed giggles. Some made no attempt to hide their amusement, openly pointing and whispering to their neighbors. Zoe's face burned with humiliation as she bent to pick up her scattered things. Her father's wide sleeves made the simple task awkward and clumsy. "Careful there, soldier," Tyler whispered, leaning over, pretending to help, but actually making the situation worse by kicking her. "Pencil under the table. Don't want you calling in an airstrike on the chemistry lab." His voice was loud enough for the students around him to hear, and another wave of laughter swept through the room. Zoe's hands clenched into fists as she stood up straight, her knuckles white against the faded green fabric of her father's uniform. Every instinct screamed at her to fight back, to protect herself, to make Tyler pay for his cruelty. But she'd learned long ago that retaliation only made things worse, only gave the bullies more ammunition to use against her. So she said nothing, simply returned to her seat and tried to focus on Mrs. Patterson's lesson on chemical bonds, even though the words seemed to float meaninglessly in the air. The whispers continued throughout the lesson, a constant background noise of judgment and speculation. Why is she dressed like that? Is she trying to be provocative? Maybe she's having some kind of breakdown? Every comment felt like a tiny cut, and by the time the bell rang, Zoe felt like she was bleeding from 1,000 tiny wounds. Lunch brought no relief. The cafeteria was a social minefield on the best of days, but today, it felt like enemy territory. Zoe picked up her tray and walked down the lunch line, acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed her every step. The women working in the cafeteria looked at her curiously, but said nothing, though she did notice one nudge another and point in her direction. She found an empty table in the far corner of the cafeteria, as far away from the popular kids' territory as possible. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. It protected her from direct confrontation, but it also made her a more obvious target. Sitting alone in her uniform, a beacon of otherness in a sea of conformity, for a few precious minutes she thought she would make it through lunch unscathed. She picked up her sandwich without tasting it, trying to ignore the occasional bursts of laughter from nearby tables where she was sure they were making fun of her. But her triumph was short-lived. Madison Torres appeared at her table like a perfectly groomed storm cloud, accompanied by her usual entourage of followers. Brittany Walsh and Chloe Martinez stood just behind their leader, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed cruelty. These were the girls who ruled the social hierarchy of Lincoln High with an iron fist and designer gloves, and they clearly thought Zoe's uniform was an affront to their authority. "Listen, military brat," Madison began, her voice carrying that special tone of fake concern that popular girls had spent generations perfecting. She sat down across from Zoe without being invited. Her perfectly applied makeup and strategically tousled hair were a stark contrast to Zoe's otherwise pristine face and simple ponytail. "We get that you're trying to be cool or whatever, but this whole suit thing is getting really old." Around them, the cafeteria began to quiet down, conversations fading as the students sensed the drama brewing. The phones had magically appeared, unnoticed but ready to capture everything that was about to happen. It was better than reality TV. This was a real-life high school war, and everyone wanted a front-row seat. "Maybe you should try shopping at regular stores instead of army surplus," Brittany added with a laugh like broken glass. "I mean, there are so many cute boutiques in town. We could take you shopping sometime." The offer was made with such obvious insincerity that it felt more like an insult than an invitation. Chloe nodded enthusiastically, her voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining something to a small child. "Yeah, like, we're not trying to be mean or anything, but you're kind of making everyone uncomfortable. It's like you're trying too hard to be different, you know?" Zoe's fist tightened around her plastic fork so hard her knuckles turned white. The cafeteria had gone almost completely silent. Hundreds of eyes focused on their table like spectators at a gladiator fight. She could feel the weight of their collective judgment. The hungry anticipation of students who smelled blood in the water. Period. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping across the linoleum floor, a sound that seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, but there was a fire in her eyes that made Madison's confident smirk falter slightly. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Zoe said, her voice level, but carrying an undercurrent of something dangerous. Something that suggested depths these girls couldn't possibly imagine. Madison's smirk was back, emboldened by her audience and her own sense of social invulnerability. She sat back in her chair with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for her cruelty. "Oh, please," she said, her voice raised so everyone in the cafeteria could hear. "What are you going to do?" "Call Daddy to come rescue you." The words hit Zoe like a physical blow, and for a moment that stretched into an eternity, the entire cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. Just as Zoe opened her mouth to respond, her lips parted to speak the words that would either destroy her completely or finally reveal the truth she had been carrying like a stone in her chest. A sound unlike anything Lincoln High had ever heard shattered the tense silence. It began as a distant hum, barely perceptible beneath the fluorescent hum of the cafeteria, but within seconds it grew into a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The cafeteria windows shook violently in their frames, causing several students to instinctively duck under their tables. Trays of food crashed to the floor as the thunderous noise grew louder, more intense, until it seemed to be coming from within everyone's chest. Madison's confident smirk disappeared as she looked around wildly, her perfectly coiffed hair whipping around her face as she tried to locate the source of the overwhelming noise. "What the hell is that?" Tyler Brooks shouted over the roar, but his voice was barely audible against the mechanical roar that now dominated all other sounds. The overhead lights flickered ominously, and somewhere in the kitchen, dishes clattered to the floor as the entire building seemed to vibrate with increasing intensity. Period. Through the large windows that ran along the east wall of the cafeteria, a huge shadow passed overhead, blocking out the afternoon sun and plunging the room into temporary darkness. Students pressed their faces to the glass, phones already on and recording, as a spectacle that belonged in war movies, not suburban high schools, materialized above them. A Black Hawk helicopter, its rotors whipping the air into a visible vortex, appeared above the school as if from another world. The craft was enormous, its olive-green body glinting in the sun as it circled the building with military precision. The distinctive sound of its rotors created a rhythm that seemed to match the collective heartbeat of everyone watching from below. "Saints," someone whispered, though the words were lost in the overwhelming noise. "Is this really happening?" The helicopter made one full circle over Lincoln High, then turned sharply toward the football field. Students dropped their food without hesitation. Chairs scraped and fell as hundreds of teenagers rushed for windows and exits. The teachers tried desperately to maintain some semblance of order, but even they were craning their necks and pulling out their phones to capture the unprecedented scene unfolding outside. "Everyone, remain calm." Mrs. Patterson's voice was barely audible as she tried to rally her students, but her own eyes were wide with surprise as she watched the military jet descend toward the 50-yard line. "Please remain seated." But her words fell on deaf ears. The cafeteria erupted into controlled chaos as students pressed for the exits, desperate to get out and witness what was happening on the football field. Madison and her team were caught up in the crowd. Their earlier confidence was replaced by confusion and a growing sense that they were dealing with something far more serious than a simple lunchtime confrontation. Zoe remained frozen at her desk, watching the helicopter through the window as it landed with precise precision on the football field. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, and her hands were shaking as recognition set in. She knew this plane, knew the unit markings painted on its side, knew exactly why it was there and what it meant. The helicopter's engines began to slow, but the rotors continued to spin as uniformed figures began to emerge from the plane. Even from a distance, Zoe could make out the crisp lines of their dress uniforms, the glint of polished brass and ribbons that told stories of service and sacrifice. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized one of the figures who stepped onto the field. Tall, commanding, silver hair visible beneath a military cap. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, her father's former commanding officer, the woman who had brought the news that had changed Zoe's life forever 3 years ago. Director Williams's voice crackled over the PA system, cutting through the animated chatter and speculation that filled the hallways. His usually calm demeanor gave way to barely controlled surprise as he made an announcement that would be remembered long after graduation day. "Attention, students and faculty," his voice echoed through the building, competing with the still spinning rotors of the helicopter outside. "We have an unusual situation developing on campus. Zoe Chun, please report to the main office immediately. I repeat, Zoe Chun to the main office." The announcement struck the crowd like an electric shock. Hundreds of heads turned to look at Zoe, who was still standing motionless in the cafeteria. Her father's enormous uniform suddenly felt both too big and too small. Whispers began immediately, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. "Zoe Chun. Who is it? The girl in the army fatigues. What did she do? Is she in trouble? Why is the military here because of her?" Madison's face went white. Her earlier bravado was evaporating as the implications of the situation began to sink in. The girl she'd been bullying, the butt of her cruel jokes about calling her dad, was somehow connected to the military helicopter that had just landed on their high school football field. Tyler Brooks looked like he might puke. His face had turned a sickly green as he realized that his battlefield sound effects and explosion jokes might have been directed at someone with actual military connections. Period. As Zoe started to walk toward the main office, the crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. The students who had laughed at her just minutes before now watched in stunned silence, their phones capturing every step of her journey through the halls. The combat boots that had seemed so out of place that morning now made a different sound on the linoleum floor. Not awkward or attention-seeking, but purposeful, deliberate. Teachers were emerging from their classrooms, drawn by the noise and the continuing sound of the helicopter rotors outside. Even the most cynical of teachers, the ones who had seen it all over their decades of work, stood in doorways with expressions of surprise and curiosity. This was unprecedented, extraordinary, an event that would be talked about for years. Through the windows lining the main hallway, Zoe could see more troops exiting the helicopter. They moved with the precise, coordinated efficiency of people accustomed to ceremony and protocol. A small crowd of soldiers lined the football field, their dress uniforms immaculate despite the wind from the still-turning propellers. Madison and her friends followed at a distance, no longer the confident queens of the school, but the uncertain observers of something they did not understand. Their earlier ridicule had given way to a growing sense of dread, the realization that they might have made a terrible mistake. The girl they had derided as an attention seeker was walking toward a meeting with military officials who had arrived by helicopter, and the implications of that fact were beginning to sink in. "What do you think is going on?" Brittany whispered to Madison, her voice quiet and uncertain. Madison did not answer. She couldn't answer. For the first time in her high school career, she was completely out of her element, watching events unfold that were beyond her understanding or control. The social hierarchy that had seemed so important just minutes before suddenly seemed trivial and meaningless in the face of everything that was happening on the football field. Dawn. As Zoe approached the main office, she saw Colonel Mitchell through the window, tall and dignified in her dress uniform. The woman who had been present at the lowest point in Zoe's life was here, at her school, carrying something that would change everything again. The entire school had gathered on the football field in a scene that violated every rule and protocol Lincoln High had ever established. What began as curious students skipping class had turned into a mass exodus as teachers, administrators, and even cafeteria workers joined in the unprecedented gathering. The Black Hawk helicopter sat in the middle of the field like a sleeping giant. Its rotors had finally fallen silent, but its presence commanded the undivided attention of the nearly 2,000 people who now formed a huge semicircle around the craft. Principal Williams stood nervously next to Colonel Sarah Mitchell, his usual authority diminished by the presence of a decorated military officer whose chest was adorned with ribbons and medals that spoke of decades of service and sacrifice. The colonel's silver hair was pulled back into a standard bun beneath her dress cap, and her posture exuded the quiet composure that comes from leading soldiers in impossible situations. Zoe walked out of the school building, followed by two junior officers, their polished boots clicking in unison on the concrete path that led to the field. The crowd parted before them like a living curtain. Hundreds of faces turned to watch her move, expressions ranging from curiosity to awe to growing understanding. The girl who had been ridiculed and scorned just hours before now walked with the dignity of someone being escorted to receive their highest honors. Madison Torres stood frozen near the stands, her face pale as she watched the procession. The cruel words she'd spoken in the mess hall, "Get your daddy to come save you," reverberated in her head like a curse. Next to her, Tyler Brooks looked like he might collapse. His earlier jokes about explosions and airstrikes now seemed not just inappropriate, but potentially devastating in their cruelty. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward as Zoe approached, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet field through the portable microphone one of her aides had quickly set up. The sound system came to life, and when she spoke, her words reached every corner of the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, students and faculty of Lincoln High," she began, her voice calm and commanding. 3 years ago, on October 15th, Staff Sergeant David Chun made the ultimate sacrifice serving his country in Afghanistan. He died saving 12 members of his unit when their convoy was ambushed near Kandahar. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the enormity of the moment began to sink in. This wasn't a drill, a demonstration, or some educational program. This was real, personal, and heartbreaking in a way most of these kids had never experienced. Colonel Mitchell continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke of a man she clearly respected and admired. Sergeant Chen was a communications specialist, a father, and a hero who put the lives of his fellow soldiers above his own safety. When the convoy came under heavy fire, he left the relative safety of his armored vehicle to establish communications that would bring salvation to his trapped comrades. He was killed by sniper fire while carrying out that mission, but his actions saved 12 lives. Zoe stood at attention next to the colonel, tears streaming down her face as she listened to a story she knew by heart but had never heard told to such an audience. Her father's collars felt heavy on her chest, and the baggy uniform that had seemed so awkward this morning now felt like armor, protecting her from the weight of the spotlight. His daughter Zoe, the colonel pointed to her, honors his memory every year on this day by wearing his uniform. She carried his legacy quietly with dignity, never seeking attention or recognition, simply remembering a father who died serving something greater than himself. The silence on the field was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of movement and the occasional sob from someone in the crowd. Even the most cynical of the seniors, the ones who prided themselves on being too cool to care, stood transfixed by the unfolding ceremony. Colonel Mitchell reached into a wooden presentation case held by one of her aides. From it, she pulled out a folded American flag, its red, white, and blue fabric crisp and perfect, and a smaller wooden box that seemed to glow in the daylight. "We're here today to present Zoe with two items that have been a long time coming," the colonel announced. First, this flag that flew over Ford Operating Base, where her father served and died. It was lowered to half-mast in his honor, waiting for the right moment to be presented to his family. She handed the flag to Zoe's shaking hands, its weight both lighter and heavier than she had expected. The fabric was soft but substantial, and she could almost feel the history it carried, the lives it represented, the sacrifices it symbolized. And second, the colonel opened the wooden box to reveal a medal that caught the sunlight and seemed to radiate its own inner light. The Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration, was posthumously awarded to Staff Sergeant David Chen for his extraordinary heroism and sacrifice. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, but it wasn't the usual clapping at a school assembly. It was something deeper, more reverent, the kind of applause reserved for moments that transcend ordinary experience. Students who had never given military service a second thought wiped away tears, while the teachers who had seen decades of graduations and ceremonies stood in awe of something unprecedented. As Colonel Mitchell pinned the medal to Zoe's uniform, to her father's, she leaned close and whispered something only Zoe could hear. "He would have been so proud of the woman you have become. His courage lives on in you." The ceremony ended with a moment of silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. 2,000 people stood together in honor of a man most of them had never heard of before that day. When it was over, the spell was broken, but something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere of Lincoln High. Tyler Brooks was the first to approach Zoe as the crowd began to disperse. His face was streaked with tears, and his voice shook as he spoke. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Your dad, he was a real hero. I didn't know. I'm so sorry for what I said, for what I did." Zoe looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the clown who had tormented her, but a 17-year-old boy who had just learned something profound about consequences and respect. "He was," she said simply. "And now you know why I wear this uniform. Not for attention, but to remember that heroes are real, and sometimes they're closer than you think." Then Madison walked up, her usual confidence completely shattered. The girl who had ruled the school's social hierarchy with casual cruelty now looked small and lost. "Zoe, she began, then stopped, seemingly unable to find the words that would do the job. "I said horrible things about your father. I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Zoe said, but there was no anger in her voice, only a quiet sadness. "You saw someone else and decided that made them a target. Maybe next time you'll think about what you don't know before you decide to hurt someone." As the helicopter prepared to take off, its rotors spinning again, the students began to realize that they had witnessed something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The girl in the fatigues was no longer a target for ridicule, but a reminder that everyone carries stories, that heroism exists in the real world, and that sometimes the people we dismiss or ignore are connected to something bigger than the social hierarchy of a school. Zoe stood on the field long after the Black Hawk had disappeared into the daylight sky, clutching her father's medal and feeling his presence more strongly than she had since the day he died. Lincoln High had been forever changed around her, and she knew that when she donned his uniform again, it would be with the understanding and respect she had always deserved. The story would spread beyond the school, beyond the city, a reminder that the children of heroes walk among us, carrying their parents' legacies with quiet dignity until the moment came for that legacy to shine.